그럼 마지막으로 레슬리 마 발제를 청해 듣겠습니다. 레슬리 마는 2022년 4월부터 뉴욕 메트로폴리탄 미술관 근현대 아시아 미술부의 최초의 동남아시아 지역 연구 큐레이터로 재직 중입니다. 2013년부터 2022년까지는 홍콩의 M+ 미술관에서 초대 서예 수목화, 잉크 아트의 큐레이터로 재직했습니다. 하버드에서 학사를, 뉴욕 대학교에서 석사를 취득한 후 UC 샌디에고에서 전후 대만 추상화에 대한 논문으로 박사 학위를 받았습니다. 오늘은 표식 만들기의 정치학 1960, 70년대 하종현 회화라는 제목으로 발제해 주시겠습니다.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to this prestigious forum. I'm very honored to be here to share my thoughts on this great artist. Of course, there has already been excellent scholarship on Mr. Ha's work, as we have heard, but both in Korean and English. My research is hugely indebted to their work. As an art historian and curator, I tend to think of artists both within their original context and in a comparative framework. My investigation focused on ways to think about his critical role in the development of Korean art and as one of the key practitioners of post-war art, internationally speaking. While art development in different cities and communities is based on their own timelines and factors, I want to bring seemingly disparate practices and outputs in relation to Ha's work to think about the conditions of art making in post-war societies and perhaps offer the larger context of Ha's radical contribution that the upcoming exhibition will illuminate. Since the upcoming Art Sonje exhibition will showcase his early work from the 1950s through the 1970s, I will discuss the history of Mr. Ha's mark-making from gestural abstraction in the so-called Korean informal style to geometric, non-figurative painting, then from sculptural installation to the era of Dansaekhwa. I will focus on how he created lines, dots, patterns, and textures in two-dimensional and three-dimensional spaces, and in result, the artistic language he built through mark making. And this particular quote singles out this idea of a single stroke of line, as Mr. Ha talked about how his mark making will make a difference. Mark making offers insights into process and medium, as well as the approach to material and environment that Ha and his generation of artists were most obsessed in engaging as a way to respond to the rapidly changing socio-political conditions. Mark making is central to artistic practices across geographies and time periods, and will thus serve as a basis of comparison in the task to situate Ha's practice in an international context. While art making for Ha and his Korean peers is central to the enterprise of advancing the trajectory and international currency of a nation's art and personal expressions, I will argue that it is Ha's urgency in each operation of gesture or contact that highlighted the intersection between the personal, the social, and the aesthetic. It is the politics of his mark making that underscores his critical role in post-war art. My affinity to Ha's early pursuit stems from my academic work. I studied the modernist groups Fifth Moon Painting Society and Dongfang Painting Society, founded in Taipei in 1957 and 1956, respectively. The art, here you see Fifth Moon Painting Society on the screen. The artist groups in Taiwan shared generational burden, woes, and aspirations with their South Korean counterparts in striking ways. Born in 1930s in mainland China and relocated to Taiwan around 1949 when the Communist Party established their regime, many of the young artists were steeped in Chinese ink painting and calligraphy in their upbringing. They learned to make oil painting and sculpture following the Japanese curriculum that remained in the art programs in universities in Taiwan after the war. Similar to the artists coming of age in South Korea during this period, the experiences in a post-colonial society under authoritarian governments and foreign aid, war and displacement, as well as strong aspirations to modernity, propelled them to cherry-pick inspirations from various sources to reconsider the framework and appearances of visual art. Modernity was an obsession and an imperative, and whatever means that could help break from what the older generation represented, whether it was altering the instruments, materials, subject, and ways to capture the ethos of the times, sparked debate and accelerate the process of transformation. As art historian Jong Ki observed, for the Korean artists in the 1950s, the, quote, process of reconstruction meant embracing abstraction more vigorously than before, unquote. Well, we all know Taiwan and South Korea have been constantly compared in the context of post-war economic development, social reconstruction, and democratic evolution. The development of post-war art in the two places share many similar challenges and dilemmas and deserves more thoughtful investigation. Against the backdrop of Cold War geopolitics and the conservatism of the nationalist government in Taiwan, artists navigated around cultural nationalism while exploring the possibilities of personal transcendence. Most of the artists of the Fifth Moon Painting Society were graduates of the art department of the National Normal University, which had a similar curriculum on ink painting and Western painting, like Hongik University, where Ha studied. The artists in Taipei started their project to modernize Chinese painting around 1957 with a quick succession of Cubist and Surrealist influenced work to informal, as this kind of sampling was the most intuitive way to immerse in a subversive spirit against the artistic orthodoxy and proclaim legitimacy through an international language. To them, these borrowed influences, though decades delayed, provided them the ammunition to deviate from the traditional ways of making painting. After a short association with informal, the Chinese painters in Taiwan went back to mine traditions for their culturally specific nutrients of abstraction, the lingua franca in international art of the liberal Western world. In the early 1960s, the Fifth Moon artists returned to what they considered the greatest asset of their culture as the main source of reinvention, Chinese ink painting and calligraphy. The presence of the treasures from the imperial collection that the government painstakingly moved from mainland China to Taiwan provided the backbone of their investigation. In truth, their rebellious attitude toward art making did not target tradition itself, only the art establishment and their conservatism. Similarly, many artists of the Tongfang Painting Society, the other most active modernist group in Taipei, were also heavily influenced by surrealist and informal styles, but their citation of Chinese culture expanded from painting to the abstract elements in seal carving, bronze, and ceramics, as they were the first group of artists to embrace abstraction in the early 1950s. If we look at Fifth Moon artist Zhuang Zhe on the left, his collage paintings that began around 1963, where he tore and pasted paper used for domestic furnishing on top of canvases and added ink and oil marks on top, or Dongfang artist Xiao Qing on the right, his informal inflicted canvases from the late 1950s with unruly strokes and fields of primary colors, one can see a particular urge to restart at the fundamental level of mark making to destabilize the primacy of image. In an era defined by disruption, lineages from traditions were rightfully questioned. Zhuang Zhe based his collage on calligraphic impulses and splattered ink techniques in Chinese painting with diluted paint. Xiao Qing bypassed the traditional ink painting tropes and went farther back to marks on ritual objects. Abstract art, to Zhuang and Xiao's generation, could thus be understood both as a gesture toward internationalization and as a recuperative effort to establish deeper connections with Chinese cultural roots after national and personal crises. At the same time, it offered room for individual freedom and satisfied a cosmopolitan ambition in an era of martial law. Abstraction also became a primary language in Ha Chong-Hyun's work since his informal period in the mid-1960s. This painting in the MMCA collection from 1965 shows how he used abstract shapes and evocative strokes to state his stance on the stagnant debate between Western and Oriental styles of painting. Textures on the surface that resemble sutures, raised scars, or earthenware patterns, and the earthy, stormy tonality are typical of this period of Korean abstraction that contrasted the doctrines of modernized ink painting. Ha said, "Informal was forlorn and dark to reflect the times." This is a quote. With this development, Ha joined the international cohort of post-war painters, Fontana, Burri, Bontacu, and others, that collectively, quote, destroyed the picture, in the sense that the disruption between 2 and 3 dimensions was one of the ways the painters reflected their ruptured reality through their craft while overthrowing preconceptions of the capabilities of painting. But this is where the similarities between Ha Chong-Hyun and his counterparts in Taiwan end. While artists in Taiwan were more concerned about reconfiguring the visuality and aesthetics of traditions in their paintings, Ha's pursuit from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s remained connected to the policy of cultural preservation alongside the new vista that came from urbanization. Ha's abstraction dramatically changed after 1965 to geometric constructions, which would linger as a backbone of his output in the next decade. In this painting, he wove strips of canvas into a mat-like painting and evoked textile design. The patterns from the warp and weft are labor-intensive and formulaic in terms of method, but the challenge to the flatness of painting and whether a woven plane can still be considered painting continued. Another series of work made between 1967 and 69, titled White Paper for Urban Planning, inspired by the contours observed from the aerial views of the country's redevelopment. The critic Yi Il labeled this short phase a, quote, return to constructivism, unquote. The painting comprises the articulated shapes and contours resembling topographical maps or folded graph paper. The slickness of the surface also suggests the emergence of a commercial visual culture in Korean society. Ha's marks on the canvas were disciplined and in tandem with the mixed feeling toward the built environment. The evocative colors of the abstracted cityscapes came from Korean folk artifacts and architectural elements. The desire to insert lived experiences into painting intensified during this phase, and the layers of impact are literally reflected in the folded canvas on the right, on the bottom of this composition. The depiction of folded paper in the pictorial plane literally extended to the substrate itself. Curator Kyung-an deemed the accordion folds relief-like and break free from the two-dimensional trappings of traditional painting. A sense of utopianism was built into the compressed construction, especially in the optimism of the colors. But the reference to the Korean traditional folk art seems to also reminisce about the past. Key had noted that the work refers to Ha's reflections of, quote, a world that aspired to full-on industrialization, but was also deeply skeptical about its possible implications and effects, unquote. Though using the language of abstraction, Ha's recuperation of traditional culture drew not from ancient imperial legacies, but more quotidian references, which could be interpreted as a call for progressive art and its aesthetics to be closer to Korean everyday life. Ha famously wrote in the publication of AG, the avant-garde art organization for which he was a founder and a spokesperson, about his attitude toward the city and art. So this quote, I realize is an English translation from the Korean, but there's a few words I would like to emphasize, which is the aesthetics and also the social. And the way that Ha mentioned that relationship with the built environment in personal, aesthetic, and social ways will further be investigated in his later works. The next move of Ha's exploration between art making and environment naturally migrated to making marks and volumes in the environment. He had lamented that he, quote, lost a desire for drawing, unquote, eager to break from that particular notion of art around the same time that the art community became enamored by Li Yufan's call to attention, the encounter between materials and its natural states of being. The AG group in particular urged their members to move their thinking beyond mediums. Quotidian objects in the built environment were employed in ushering a new aesthetic. Cement placed on the foot of an interior column or cardboard toilet paper roll cut in half were Ha's experimental works that intervened directly into the three-dimensional space. The most striking work in this vein is Relation 72-1, where a piece of braided rope is strung between two sides of a horizontal wooden frame resting in the middle of a room. The taut suspension indicated through the frayed, unraveled skein suggests an invisible force and drama. The air around the piece is charged, fraught, but also resilient, while the object is laid bare. One inevitably think of the social condition around its making. The metaphor generated through the intersection between the personal, artistic, and social proves to be an impactful one that enabled the next articulation that Ha puts forth as he returned to painting. Tying barbed wire and spring coils onto canvas in a grid or linear formations became Ha's key output between 1972 and 74. The extent to which the barbed wire bite into the canvas surface is precarious and hard to measure, but it is precisely that material tension between vulnerability and tolerance, perpetration and resistance, that his painting register is psychological in addition to physical charge. Quote, "When I cut or burn my hands on the wired barbs, I know I'm in the work," unquote. This suggests Ha's mark making inserts the artist within the operation. The regularity of the grid, as opposed to its precarious spiral forms in real-life situations of deterrence and harm, seem to create another level of menace associated with the built environment of prisons, fences, or borders. The painting assemblages made with springs also harness an formidable energy of rebound after repression. Ha crafted this material, again, labor-intensive like his woven canvas pieces, with minimalist precision and austerity, but its pared-down aesthetic references is a more menacing context. Ha's marks of protrusion and entrapment straddle between, quote, everyday objects, an extraordinary harrowing kind, and an assault on the painting surface that reverberated through the Korean art world. Decades later, Palestinian artist Mona Hatoum made a series of sculptures using barbed wires that compose a gridded space in cube form. In Impenetrable from 2009, the barbed wire rods, vertically suspended by fishing wire, serve as lines that compose and convey presence and absence created by the space. The wires became a visual marvel and a psychological paradox. It also evokes the structure of prisons, fences, or borders that harnesses the unspeakable. Hatoum's mark is invisible, but similar to Ha's relation 72-1, it is that incredibly charged potentiality and painful beauty harbored in the contraction and violence that make the work compelling. With ongoing conflicts around the world, Ha's work seems to strike a new meaning just as Hatoum's has. As Ha's relation and barbed wire and spring series seem to turn paintings into a metaphor for resistance and suffering, Ha rejected the lure of complacency and came back to the material paint and a substrate as he channels his experimentation on encounters. Quote, "At first, I thought that painting was not enough for me to fully express my thoughts, so I expanded my works to include an increasingly diverse array of materials. Paradoxically enough, however, I came to believe that single form of expression would be able to accommodate a wider range of materials and forms," unquote. That tension enacted on the painting surface were expressed in the actions of squeezing and pushing, as well as the time that is the key agent in the process that expresses the material responses more fully. This represented the beginning of the Conjunction series in 1974, which would be the main thread of Ha's output to the present. As Ha pushed paint from the one side of hemp cloth to the other with the additional action of dragging and smudging, evoking the movement of brushstrokes, he returned to more painterly mark making that combined the traces of the artist's hand. Much has been written and spoken about his signature way of applying paint, and I wanted to shift the focus to other parallel developments in abstract painting that would contextualize Ha's practice among his contemporaries. As the legacy of the abstract expressionism remained a looming presence for New York artists of the late 1960s and early 1970s, artists of the later generation labored to find new languages that both tie their abstraction to their lived environment and break free from the prescribed ways of making painting. While it may not felt immediate in the Korean context, abstract expressionism did have an impact on the Korean artists because of its global reach, especially because Korea is a strategic ally of the US and received its cultural output in the Cold War years. Looking to artists in New York of the same period, David Diao, who was born in China and moved to the United States in 1955, began in 1972 to apply acrylic onto canvas on the floor, using garment tube turned roller to push, drag, and sweep layers of paint, allowing the element of chance and time for the paint to fall and accumulate onto the surface. The resulting pictures have a luscious surface and striking colors that rejected the calculated paintings of splatters and strokes that Pollock, Klein, and the likes had ossified the canon. Diao's friend, Jack Whitten, also began to make his programmed or photographic paintings with squeegees, blades, and other mark-making tools in the mid-1970s. By placing pieces of wire, metal sheets, and stones between the canvas and drawing board between painting, Whitten created imprints of objects and materials that were part of his sculptural language that seemed to make his pictures a record of both a personal message and something resembling an aerial landscape. But as Ha's peers tried to distance themselves from the effects of the artist's hand through unorthodox tools, or in a way systemize their mark-making to connect to their daily lives and social environs, Ha has a much more tactile engagement with his surface. As scholars have noted that the varied textures of Ha's painting resist the seamlessness of others associated with Dansaekhwa, international peers, or precedents, Ha's work reflect a, quote, a union between the artist's fingers and paint, unquote. That the surface of the conjunction series resembles clay, cement, snow, plaster, or mud suggests a rough sculptural or even natural aesthetic that none of his peers in Korea or those in the Western centers pursued. Perhaps this refers to the developing Korean society with much plasticity and unspoken muteness, or a rejection of the conclusiveness that a highly capitalized world would have signified. Or perhaps more radically, this refusal to comply or conform even to the way pushed paint would rest on the hemcloth surface to obscure the product of chance and to give the viewer more room for engagement with the material seems to be another form of complicating that material counter once over. I want to bring the conclusion of my investigation in Ha's work back to the comparison to modern paintings in Taiwan at the beginning of this presentation. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Ha exhibited his work in Taiwan at both state-funded and privately run organizations, all occasions labeled as an alliance of Asian artists. Ha was included in 3 exhibitions in Taipei: modern painting from Korea at the National History Museum in 1977, the new École du Sol group exhibition at Spring Gallery, a private exhibition space, in 1983, and contemporary Korean art exhibition in 1984 at the newly established Taipei Fine Arts Museum. In fact, this exhibition happening at this time is quite extraordinary because the Taipei Fine Arts Museum was only established a year before. The 1984 show had been categorized by the critic Kim Bok-young, a close friend and supporter of Ha, in the Taipei Fine Arts Museum catalog, that the works are presentations of, quote, primordial being of nature, unquote. Quote again, there is every reason that we ourselves are contacting things through bodily exercise by drawing, painting, blotting out, penetrating, dripping. Those are our essential techniques, unquote. Though the documentation of Ha's participation in Taiwanese archives are rather incomplete, only scant images of the installation views of these shows are extant or even useful, and the local criticism on these exhibitions barely matched the substantial investigations Korean artists had made in painting and sculpture. It is significant to note that the export of Korean art, at least to another Asian country, was much more diverse and inclusive than how today's art historical framework and market interest, at least the ones available to me as a non-Korean reader, is. By the 1970s, most of the modernist painters I compared Ha to all had left Taiwan for Europe, the United States, or Hong Kong. The local art community was driven by nativism, a grassroots cultural consciousness in all aspects of productions as a response to the increasingly isolated international status of Taiwan. Critics in Taipei saw Korean artists through a nationalist lens based on their own situation, but the aesthetic harmony among the featured Korean artists was palpable. The implication of how Korean art impacted Taiwanese artists remained to be investigated, but this series of encounters allows my thinking toward Ha Chong-Hyun's work to have a broader context. I hope my survey of the array of mark-making strategies and expressions of Ha in the 1960s and 70s provided a perspective on his work in the larger art historical context. I look forward to your feedback and discussions. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 하종현 작가 작업을 설명할 때 전후 아시아라는 그 같은 시간성과 장소성을 공유하는 한국 화단과 대만 화단을 비교해서 설명을 해주셨습니다. 또 서구 문화를, 서구 미술을 받아들이는 과정에서 각국 화가들의 추상화를 향한 열망, 또 실험을 공통적으로 알 수 있었습니다. 저희가 지금 시간이 많이 초과가 되어서 잠깐 20분까지 5분 정도만 휴식 시간을 가지고요. 4시 20분부터 패널 토론 관람객 질문을 받을 예정입니다. 감사합니다.